Our guest today is Soraya Ramos. For more than a decade, Soraya has worked to promote and support anti racist teaching and learning practices through her roles as a teacher and as an assessment designer. Soraya served as senior associate at the Center for Collaborative Education. There, she worked in partnership with schools and districts in New England and nationally to design high quality performance assessment systems that promote equity and engagement, and co led a consortium of districts in Massachusetts in their pursuit of designing an alternative assessment and accountability system. Soraya is currently an assessment design partner at Envision Learning Partners, where she partners with districts across the nation to design and implement high quality systems of assessment, ranging from student led conferences to portfolio defenses. Soraya believes that lasting assessment systems need to be in alignment with a community's vision and coherent to a district and school's priorities. She holds an EDM in Education Policy and Management from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a BA in Chicano Studies and Political Science from the University of California, Los Angeles. I'm so excited for the episode. Let's dive in.
I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-creating curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Soraya Ramos, welcome to the Time for Teachership podcast. I'm so excited you're here.
Hi, Lindsay. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I'm really excited we were talking about before we hit record, like all of the ways that our paths have like almost intersected. And I think our work aligns very closely as well. So really excited for listeners to hear from you today. And I just want to know if there's anything that folks should keep in mind as they are engaging with this podcast episode today.
I thought about this one, and I think one of the main things for me that I try to remember is that I'm always a learner and that I'm always learning and that I don't always have it or need to know everything or need to have the answer. So I think that being really forgiving to myself and gracious that like I'm always learning, we're always learning, and it's just part of like life. We're always evolving, making mistakes and then learning from them and coming back from it. So I want to like, hold whatever I say now at this point in time might evolve in the next years or decades of my life. So I'm really excited to capture where I'm at right now with you.
I absolutely love that framing because just this morning I was looking back from like 4 years ago, I wrote blog posts and I'm like, wouldn't have said it the same way. Would have changed that. Like, that's so true. I love the snapshot in time idea.
It's true.
So
It's
good.
true. I think it's what we want to do with kids too, right? They're always evolving and physically growing, and like we see the difference. So I'm glad that it resonates with you as well.
Deeply. Yes. Thank you for that framing. And I think it'll also be really nice for listeners to hear it just because I think in our days we can often be unforgiving of ourselves. And so it's a nice reminder. We're in it together. We're all learning. I love it. And so I guess kind of to think about the continuation of this, like the place we're all trying to go as we learn. I like to ground this, or all episodes really, in Dr. Bettina Love's words around freedom dreaming, where she says, their dreams grounded in the critique of injustice. And so I'm curious to know, what is that big dream that you hold for education?
I love her work. I will say that this question got me thinking of like what my freedom dreaming was maybe 10 years ago is slightly different, but still similar to the core. But one thing that came to mind around what is that dream that I have for kids, for my younger self, for the kids that come after me, is that all children, all young learners get to access high quality learning experiences that help them feel like they can shine and that they can tap into their brilliance and their genius.
That's so good. I love that. And I love that there's like aspects of, Goldie Muhammad's work in there, and just like that the genius is part of all kids, right? This is not something that we as educators give to them, but like this is there and we're just like helping to cultivate and helping to shine. And like, I love that framing.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. Like, it's like, where did I get all this from? I'm like, I've learned from people who have taught me, right? Or that I've learned in my roles in the past. And I think one of the things that I would add to that is like, how do we allow kids to just be kids, to learn, to fumble, and then get back up without them feeling like there's some kids have higher stakes than others. And I'm just curious of like, how do we just have them all feel like they can play and have fun?
I love that. That's so good. Thank you for that. And I think so sometimes we maybe lose sight of the things, the reasons that we kind of get into education, and that knowing that kids have this genius, they have this light, they should be able to be kids, all this stuff. And we get into like the nitty gritty and all the things on our plate, right? And so I'm wondering if there are specific mindset shifts that folks kind of go through to be able to do the work that you do, for instance, around kind of equitable assessment and all of those pieces. Are there things that we maybe know going in, lose sight of along the way, and need to really kind of reframe our thinking around that you've noticed either people be successful with, or that you would just advise folks just entering the work to think about?
My own mindsets have I've had to go through my own, and I'm still going through those shifts now, and like really believing in those. I will say some of those mindset shifts that have inspired me in the last few years have come from the work at the National Equity Project around liberatory design. And I think they were able to provide a language to what I already felt to be true. And some of those mindsets, it's all about, I think the arc of it all is that it's human centered, that we're centering anything, any experience, the design of a summer school program, the design of an assessment system on a state level or even a local level, is that we're really truly centering humans and and centering and putting them at the center. So I would say one of the things that the libertarian design framework says is one of the mindsets is building relational trust, is how do we invest in relationships with intention and especially across difference, and we have to honor people's stories and practice empathetic listening. So if I'm going into your home, into your community, what is my role? Is to be there as humble as I can to listen to your expertise because that is your lived experience. So I think that that's a really powerful piece that I always try to hold, is that I am not the knowledge holder. I am here to listen, and I am in your home, and that is in my culture. There's something really important about I respect when I'm here in your space. So that's one, build a relational trust. I think a second one for me is practicing self-awareness, is understanding like what mirror is in front of me, who am I, and how do these experiences that I grew up with influence the way I see things, the way I'm understanding an issue, and our perspectives impact our practice. So I think that practice self-awareness is constant and so necessary for me, because sometimes I feel like I'm like, oh, I'm the hero in this story, and I'm gonna save these kids, or like when I was, entering teaching, but it wasn't that. No one needs saving. So practicing self-awareness, and then I would say I have a lot that I could share, but I'm going to keep it short. But the one I really feel like that I haven't mentioned is embracing complexity. The equity challenges are really complex and they're messy and they stay open for possibility. And one thing that I have the cards in front of me, and one thing that it says here in the card is that powerful design emerges from the mess, not from avoiding it. And so I think that's where sometimes we put pressure on our leaders to have the answer, that one right way. We actually respect people who speak with a lot of confidence in that one solution, when it's like actually a lot more complex. And how do we do this together to figure it out with the humans that we're trying to serve at the center? So those are, I think, some of the top, but I could keep going, but I'll stop there. So I would say building relational trust, uh, practicing self-awareness, and embracing complexity.
Wow, all of those are so good. And also just tying it to that liberatory design piece, I think is really important and food for thought for folks who are listening now and are like, oh, I haven't heard of that, or I want to dig deeper into that. Like there's richness there to dig into. And I love the idea of the last piece really reminds me of both the complexity piece around like adaptive leadership and recognizing that it is really messy. And also I think you're speaking to the like a shared leadership element as well of right like the leaders are not necessarily the people who have admin titles, right? They're the people in the community and the students, right? And the people at the center who,
Right.
as you said, have the lived experience and are really informing the change. And to think through how to navigate so many voices when we're talking about all the students and all the families is messy, but so worth it. And so I appreciate that framing and that grounding in those three specifically.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for summarizing that in such a nice way.
I just love connecting it to like sometimes I'll use these like leadership phrases. My background is in leadership education. And so I think through like things I've said in the podcast before. I'm like, right, here's the through line.
Right. It's
Yeah.
true. Um, there's like these mindset. Yeah, we could keep going on because I'm also a leadership nerd and I'm like learning
Awesome.
all these things and how do we create a culture, right? How does our leadership impact the culture that we're trying to build here? And I think these elements, these mindset shifts have to be in there. Um, because we have to live it so that it's almost contagious. It's part of the space that you come into. Yeah.
I like the idea of contagious. That's good. That's really good. So I guess thinking about that, right? Like, what does that maybe look like, feel like? What's the actions that we take to kind of cultivate that and live that out and make that contagious? And I mean, I think about the work that you've done with equitable assessment and like systems of assessment. I mean, that's really big work. So thinking about maybe a leader or a community who is like, oh, this is such a cool idea, and it feels big, it feels messy, it feels like how right like how do I get started and what does that potentially look like? Could you describe for us a little bit about those like brave actions required to get there?
That's a really good question. And I think that I'm always in pursuit of figuring that out. This is a tangent which we can include or not in the podcast, but recently I started working the second job with my mom and it's this delivery service and we're shoppers at a store and we're shoppers at the same store every single time. And so I started doing it as like a side gig on the weekends and just trying it out with my mom. And what I realized is like every single time that I went into the store, and you let me know if I could tell you, but it's one of my favorite stores. So I go in there and I'm like, I
Totally.
know people have such a good experience at Target, and it's like a very much like good experience. And so, but going in there as a shopper, I noticed that there was a pattern. I'm like, why are the workers so disgruntled and unhappy? Is it just that one location? Is it just that one person, that one day? And I started noticing a pattern in the ones in my area where it's like, no, I think there's something going on in the culture of this company. What is going on that are we treating are how are people being treated while they work here? And it's almost, and again, it was very contagious in like my experience as a consumer versus like kind of a shopper right beside these employees was a lot different and not as joyful either. So I think that also communicates into schools, right? Like culture is everywhere. When we go into a place of business, when we go into a place of education, and I know that this is something that, you know, many educators in the field have already said, like the first signal of what a culture is at a school is when you step in the front door and you've experienced what it feels like to be in that space. It's like an energy thing. I don't know much about energy, but I could feel it. And right, it's like when you're ignored, for example, and no one really greets you, or when they do, it's kind of like, what do you need? Versus, good morning, how are you? Welcome to our school. Here's our protocol, sign in. And it's a different ex experience when you go into these spaces. So I would just say, like, what is the culture in this space? And so I would say, how do you make I think your question was, how do we start? What are the brave actions that we need to make sure is we really need to be the creators of that energy, right? Like if a school is off that morning, like how can I go in there and try to, I'm not going to change it, but I could say, just remind them like, hey, I'm new to this space. what do you want to show for your school and your community. But one of the things that the brave actions that needs to happen is the way that I work with other people, whether it's building an assessment system at a state level or building an assessment task with a teacher, is what kind of relationship are we building around my responsibilities, your like, and our accountability to each other. I think the reciprocity is a word that I've used a lot in the work I've done with in the past few years. Is it's not transactional, but it's reciprocal. Is um if we do these things for each other without keeping tab on what it is, right? Like like tit for tat. And so one of the brave actions is really holding that reciprocity part. The other part is uh recognizing oppression, like always being aware that power can always come in, and being able to like balance that out and calling it out. I think there's something really important about calling it out. If we're going to partner with each other, let's talk about what the power dynamic is or isn't. So I would say uh that's super brave action to mention it, because it's an uncomfortable and fearful conversation, especially if you're working with teachers, all the way up to superintendents or state commissioners. So that's the brave action.
Hi, this is Leah popping in to talk about the freebie for this episode, which is an overview of high quality performance assessment slides. You can find that freebie at the blog post for this episode, www.lindsaybethlyons.com/183. Now back to the
I'm
show.
thinking about another one. I think one is knowing the culture and like reading that. Working from a place of reciprocity. The one that's really challenging, and it goes against maybe the way that our country works is, and our system works, is we need to come from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. I think when we're trying to build systems or create solutions for education, we think that there aren't enough. Like, we're actually in some way conditioned or convinced in some ways, like some of us may be able to note why, but that there's always enough resources. This is really hard for me to actually understand it, right? Because in my own life, it's like, well, I grew up with very scarce resources, financial resources. So I think like understanding like there are resources out there. We may not have access to them right now, but we're gonna try, we know that they're out there. That's the thing. They just may not be right in front of us. And so I think knowing that no one's here to steal my job, we're not trying to do the work of another organization in competition with them. It's we're all playing in the same sandbox in service of the same communities, people, learners, etc. So those are just a few that come to mind, and I'm sure there's more profound other actions, but those are actually super hard. Is like the power piece. How do I work with others in ways that are loving and actually honest and authentic without my secret agenda? And while also knowing that like the resources are real, there's a perceived notion that there's scarcity out there, but there really is an abundance, and maybe the abundance comes from a different type of resource, not the financial one. Maybe the abundance is the community that we work in, and that's our superpower. So that is where I'll leave it, because I think that was a lot, but and I'm sure that's a little bit scattered, but it was my best attempt to try to put them into words.
It was perfect. Oh my gosh. I love so much of this. And I think, I mean, even just the abundance versus scarcity, I love what you said at the very end of, maybe the resource is just something that's not financial. Absolutely. I mean, so the last few years I taught, I worked at a school with 100% students who were learning English at the high school level. And so a lot of times in like multilingual learner education spaces, people are like, oh, the scarcity mindset of we need to build English language proficiencies, right? And it's like, look at the abundance of linguistic knowledge and proficiency in other languages. I mean, some of these kids are trilingual. Like, what on earth? This is nuts. Like, that is incredible. And we just don't think of the abundance frame. We think only in scarcity. And so I love that you mentioned like it can be financial, but it can be otherwise, that we think about these things. And what a huge mindset shift to be able to get to that side of abundance.
And I love that example that you're mentioning because that's where we miss it. We're conditioned to believe that these other metrics are actually more important than the richness in the culture, in the multilingualness, in like the community that they come from, their worlds or realities is it's like that's where that there's richness there that we I think the last part I'll say is like I don't know where this fits in the questions you asked me, but there's like an element of critical consciousness that it's like almost seeing behind the like someone's pulling the curtain that like these assessments are important, but I could see through them, that they are problematic, that they can cause harm, that they're imperfect, that they're a measure, but not the measure of our kids and our young people. So I think that's where my role is like, how do we get people to see recognize oppression, right? But like within that is like, how does this assessment work within that? Like, it's not the ultimate truth. And like you said, let's not ignore these beautiful, like humans that we get to work with every day and in their multilingualness and get them to shine. Mhm.
I just want to double down on that phrase, like a measure, not the measure, right? Yes, and not the ultimate truth. Yeah, we put so much stock into things that we can measure and put numbers or letters on, and it's like, no, I'm a human child. Like this is a person. Yes.
Totally. Yes.
I mean, I'm curious, you've done such powerful work with so many communities. I'm wondering if there's maybe a success story or kind of quote unquote case study that we can use to just illuminate the possible. Like, what are the great things happening out there and what can we celebrate?
I I appreciate that question, and it's the success stories I feel like you don't see it in the moment. I feel like when you work in schools or in education, sometimes it takes years for you to see your impact as a teacher, for example, and then the kids come back, and they let you know like this is the impact you had, or it could take more than 5, 10 years to see it. But I think in I've been really fortunate to have this position as like third party kind of roles in education now, where I get to support school districts and I have this different viewpoint, a lay of the land where I can kind of see who the players are and what the strategy is and the vision and etc. I one of the things uh, that I have not done this alone, and I think I've been put into really wonderful teams where I've been able to co-construct these different ways of how to assess kids, how to think about assessment in a more human-centered way. You might have, I believe that some of the previous speakers on this podcast, Ms. Rita Harvey and Charlie Brown, they're some of my we started our journey together as assessment design partners in New England. And we had, I believe, a lot of really wonderful case studies that we got to see from the teacher level. So we got to travel to different districts across New England and design assessments, performance assessments with teachers at an individual school, while also working with their superintendents to build a arc of learning around their PD. So that year, for example, I think this is we're getting to that success story is what makes it successful is that you had buy-in the from the from the teacher role all the way up to a superintendent role and the board as well. Is how do we get everyone on board about around this one thing? And that one thing for one district in particular was how do we get everyone on board around performance assessments? And so year one was, what is performance assessments? What are we doing? Why don't we bring in students that have worked with our coaches, hence me and my other colleagues, to come in and share their experiences uh, with a standardized test versus a performance assessment. And so we have this all happened in one particular district in Attleboro public schools. And so that was one of the things is we have support from all folks. We get to coach in individual schools and they all have design teams. So that the admin at the school had already pre-selected some people that they felt were going to be champions of this work. So that was a huge element. While at the same time we are facilitating a meetings with a consortium of superintendents who are all trying to work towards the same goal, which was how do we build a alternative assessment system that we can apply for a waiver for in the state of Massachusetts. So we have superintendents engaged through the consortium. We have assistant superintendents supporting us with designing an arc of learning for all teachers in the district around performance assessments year one. And we also have board meetings where that could be like our performance assessment per se, where teachers and students can come in and demonstrate their work. So I would just say like those were some of the levers that this district was able to pull and were super successful, because after year two, performance assessments didn't go away. Performance assessments, we went deeper. We said rubrics 101. So part of a performance assessment is a rubric, right? Like how do you know that you've met the target? So rubrics was like, we noticed that there was maybe we needed more literacy around that. How do we build everyone's capacity? So yeah, every year the learning arc, so everyone was doing the same thing during those teacher learning days. We had multiple opportunities for them to come and present to the consortium and to their boards. So I would just say like those are some of like a really effective leadership moves and decisions that were created in this particular district in Attleboro that we were really proud of. They were so committed and people were not confused around initiatives. It felt like they all knew what we were doing, and we were able to reach all teachers within 3 years around performance assessment. Unfortunately, things were paused because of the pandemic, but the fact that we had such good momentum, and people were just like champions, and it was like this groundswell of support. I remember that's a word that Charlie would mention a lot. We need to get the groundswell of support. And I think that was a really powerful thing instead of it coming down as a requirement.
Yes, what another like kind of tied to that shared leadership piece, right? It like it doesn't come from the top. It has to be that groundswell. That's so good. There is so much here that I appreciate. You have just kind of laid out, like if I'm thinking of a leader listening who's like, how long does it take and what happens each year? You've just laid out what is possible. And I just really appreciate that clarity for someone who's kind of new to it. I also want to speak to, if someone's unfamiliar with that consortium in Massachusetts, like New York has one as well. But just the idea of schools coming together to say, like, we can do better than standardized assessment is this really great way to not do it alone. And so I'm wondering if there is, I don't know if this is speaking to the next question I was going to ask or not, but just thinking about the challenges of the work, sometimes I wonder if it's like, oh, we're on our own in kind of this island of, we think it would be a great idea to do this, but we don't have a consortium to tap into or something like that. Is there any kind of school model that you've worked with there where it's like they're not part of a larger organization, but they're just choosing to do it because they know it's what's best and they're going to move forward?
Absolutely. I think there's folks that are connected to a wider net and others are doing it within their own district. Uh, I think that it's really helpful when you are part of a group, uh, a consortium, or whether it's a learning group or anything else. I know that there's some here in California as well, where you just get to learn around practice with each other. It's like, what are you all doing? Oh, this is how we're choosing to implement. Graduate profiles right now is a really big thing, and it actually is very trendy to have a graduate profile, or these learner outcomes of what we want kids to learn, and competencies we want them to have by the time they graduate. But how do you know, and how do you know that if you're doing it right? Like a lot of people are like, okay, great, we have really cool posters, now what? So that's where people turn to these communities where they're like, this is how we're learning how to bring this poster to life. And it's super beneficial. I'm part of this I'm really glad that I'm part of this group called Scaling Student Success, and we get to learn from each other around best practices of how to bring graduate profiles to life. And everyone's at a different stage. So there's different groupings of districts. So it is a really cool opt-in opportunity that I've seen on the West Coast. But what about folks that aren't connected outside, right? Like we know that this is best practice, period. And I think that's why some of these districts bring in third party technical providers. And that's where people like myself come in, and Envision Learning Partners, who we may not be creating the space for everyone to come in as a consortium or a learning space, but we are the communicators of, oh, you have also shortages with subs. This is actually a trend that's happening across the country. And some of the people are actually very surprised when we tell them that. They're like, really? I thought we were the only district. I'm like, oh no. I'm like, this is going on across the country. You are not the only one. And how do we get creative? So around like PDs, right? If you can't have everyone out on the same time, like how do we create this more flexible plan? So I don't know if I kind of lost track of your question, Lindsay, but
That was
it was
perfect. I guess are there any other like either challenges that folks have faced and you wanted to talk through, or is there just anything else that
cool.
you wanted to share before we move to wrap up?
Yeah. Okay. So I was like thinking, I'm like, how honest can I be? And I think I've realized how naive I've been in most of my career as an educator. And in the best way, like my naivete is more of like, I don't think people would be capable of doing this. Or, like we're all in it for the kids. And it's this very naive way of thinking. And one of the things that I've realized at a different level of is through Bowman and Deal. These folks have these four frameworks of what it means to be a leader. And one of the frameworks that they say that leaders have to learn how to navigate is the political realm. And that's like they call it the jungle, where it's like people have different agendas and people have different ideas of what they want from a project or from a collaboration or etc., whatever it is. And I think that for me has been this language, this world where I have to think about understanding humans in a different way. That the political realm introduces a not so flattering side of humans and our motivations and our behaviors, and also attached to people's wellness, right? Like if like they are reflections of who they are internally is kind of what they project at work. So one of the things for me is like, how do I read situations? What is being said that isn't being said out loud? And how do I move accordingly? Because sometimes being honest is not the way for me. Speaking the sometimes spaces aren't ready to hear that, especially when you have power involved. And so that for me is something I'm still learning, is how do we navigate the political realm and understand humans and not letting it get too like personal, like taking it personally, is understanding like what people are and aren't capable of and knowing who to trust. I think that for me right now is how do I learn to build trust and who to trust in, especially when we're doing this kind of work in education.
Oh, that's such an important challenge to name because I think a lot of folks, I've certainly been there, felt that. And I love that you trace the arc of similarly me going and being like, everyone's awesome and in it for the right reasons. And there is no political agenda. No, there is. And so I think it reminds me of Heifetz, Grashow, and Linsky talk about in their adaptive leadership stuff is like naming the stuff, like having an activity as a leader where you kind of sit in a meeting and like, okay, observe what's not being said, like observe where the avoidance is happening, where a joke's being made to deflect, like that kind of thing, right? And so it's like that's a cool tool for folks listening to this episode, like just try it, like try that out and just kind of notice or invite folks to notice like what is not being said, right? What is being avoided? And I think that's a nice opportunity to kind of, like you said, it might not be that in the moment we shout it out, but it's a nice like jot it on a post-it note, hand it in at the end of the meeting, right? We'll get there because we should.
Absolutely. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think just to close this out, this has been a wonderful conversation. I don't want it to end, but I recognize everyone has things to do, and I'm sure you have a busy schedule. So what is one thing as we kind of wrap up that listeners have been listening, tons of ideas shared, but they want to kind of take one next step as they end the episode, kind of going into their day or getting ready for next week or whatever, that they can kind of start the momentum building here?
What comes to mind personally when I'm learning and have learned to do is what kind of world do I want to live in? How do I want it to feel? How do I want it to sound for myself, for kids, for young people, etc.? And how can I be the creator of that? Of how can I contribute to a world like that? So I think that self-awareness piece goes back to that is, if I'm walking into this meeting, how do I want to walk in? What do I want to contribute in terms of my own energy, my motivations? How is this contributing to the world that I do or don't want? And I think being that is a start, and something that can feel like it's a forced, but like, how can I be that light, or how can I be that positivity or that understanding mind in the workplace, where I don't have to get to the point where I'm disrespecting people and I'm still living by my values. So I think it really begins with the self and the world that you want. So then how are you going to start being that in that next meeting, in that next um in whatever collaboration you're in. So it's really difficult because we have difficult days, but like, how do I still stay with dignity, right? Like, dignity and respect is for me really important. So knowing what people's values are and making sure that they're actually living aligned to those values, and catching yourself when you don't, because we're also imperfect. So the misalignment will happen. But just knowing that, like, what am I contributing to this world, and how can I, be self-aware?
I love that for multiple reasons. One, just for the leader lens, but also like this could be a guiding question for schools. Like, how do teachers engage with that question? How do students live out that question, right? Like, how can we just be in community with one another in alignment with our responses to that question? So good.
Right.
And so I think the final two questions I have for you, one is super fun, just could relate to education, but could totally not. So whatever direction you want to take it. You mentioned like we're all kind of learning. We're on a lifelong path of learning all the things about life. What is something that you have been learning about lately?
I have not been learning any hobbies recently, but I think what I'm learning is just my role as I'm getting older, my roles are changing in my life and who I take care of, and being a caretaker this past month. And for me, it's just understanding that, like, life will always be lifing. It's always going to be doing what it wants to do, but at the end of the day is, how am I centering myself too and my needs first, so that we're all, so that I'm strong enough to care for others when I can and I need to. So I think that's one thing that I'm really learning how to practice, whether it's an acupuncture appointment, whether it's that massage that I've been like thinking about months ago, a walk has been huge. I think learning how to slow down is the biggest lesson for me, because I used to be a runner, and it felt like if I didn't do 10 miles, I didn't do anything. Like it had to feel hard for it to feel like it mattered. And now I'm like, a walk and being patient and being in silence, like, that's actually hard for me too. So maybe those are some of the lessons that are coming. Like, life is always evolving. My role and my responsibilities are with that too. So how do I always remember myself though? And it could be, and a walk is enough. Sufficiency. Yeah.
Everything you said deeply resonates. Thank you for that. And I think finally, folks are going to just want to get in touch with you or follow your work. So what's the best place to get in touch or see what you're doing?
I am on LinkedIn, so that would be one way. I'm trying to be better at staying on it every single day, but that is one way to reach me as well, on LinkedIn. And I would say that's the best way. Like, it's more reliable way to reach me. So I'm happy to connect with anyone who's out there who'd like to just kind of be thought partners, or like if folks are going through similar things, that I shared some of the things on this podcast. I would love to just even having like a mirror or a window into, like, what are you experiencing it? Oh, okay, how did you resolve it, or etc. So I would love to get in touch with folks if they're willing to.
Amazing. Soraya, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful conversation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate you having us, and me and my other colleagues that have also come up in the episode. But thank you so much for inviting me into this conversation. I really appreciate you.
Absolutely. If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. They say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan, from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no strings attached brainstorm call at lindsaybethlyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at teachbetter.com/podcasts, and we'll see you at the next episode.